Hi everyone. Sorry about that interruption. It said never happened to me before. I guess it had to happen now. So I'll start over because the first one wasn't good. So I guess it's good that I get a do-over. So my name is Furkan. I work at Autodesk, and I'll be talking about all things buffer. So the first time, well, let's go like to I'll tell you the story about that. So when I was a kid, I had computers lying around, but I really only used it for gaming and movies. When I got to high school, we had this IT club that I could go to, but at first I wasn't accepted, so I had to try again and again to see if they would let me in. And at some point, my teacher told me that if I write a website, then he would let me in. But at the time, I didn't know anything about programming, so I was like, okay, how do I do that? And he says, well, by the way, I didn't know, like, I don't have a tool, I don't know what to do. And he just says, just write it with Notepad. Okay, at the time, I didn't know how significant this was, but it turned out, like, later when I thought back to those times, I think it was a very teachable moment for me there. I should have changed my life, but it didn't. So later on, when I started into my career, I go more and more into development, but I start using IDEs and these tools and Git, but most of the time I spend my time in the GUI side of things, so I don't know what's happening behind. In the GUI, I press a button and then suddenly I see the UI, or I have this designer that I use and I drag and drop buttons and it all works out. It wasn't until I was talking to a designer at Autodesk that she was using the Git on the command line, and seeing her do it made me think I can do it too. So I thought I'll start now. After I got into more and more into command line programs, and I came across this article called Unix as an IDE, which I have a link to at the end. You should definitely check it out. It goes great with the Vim's philosophy as well. And after that, I came to the realization that, again, this could be something like so simple, but it just changed the way that I think about things. I came to the realization that everything that we do is I/O, input and output. You type in your keyboard, the input goes into all the machinery, and then you end up with the character at the screen becomes the output, and then that becomes a file. That file becomes part of a larger structure, and that larger structure turns into a website or a program. And with that, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. You use the Unix piping and all good, but I later realized that buffers are actually input and output devices too. So you go to Vim, you input something shows up on screen, you save it, and then that is input into the file system, onto the file that you're editing. So I'll show you just as a simple example, like all these things. I can see the thing that the IDE could do, I could actually do it with a series of commands. If I were to just write this to the bash, it would give me the output. But we don't obviously do this. We have plugins, we have all the tools that enable this sort of stuff. But at the end, we're actually just manipulating input and output, and buffer being the main one of these. So talk about buffers. What is a buffer anyways, right? A buffer, you can find this in Vim doc as well. A buffer is an in-memory representation of a file. Once you open it, you're actually free to do whatever you want, and you have to write it to make it a destruction to the file. And that goes, a window is a viewport on a buffer, and a tab page is a collection of windows. I find this to be a very powerful concept. I use this a lot in my day-to-day work. If I go here and show you an example, I usually, for example, this is the Linux source code. See, I'm working on the Linux kernel. I have different tab pages with different window orientations. I find this useful, especially if you're working on two different files, you need to refer back to something. With splits are usually better, but not more than 2 or 3. And with each tab, you actually get a different working directory, so you can have your own customization for each specific tab. You can run a certain command that does one thing, and it does something else in another tab page. Okay, so we have all the buffers that we want, and how do we switch between them? The usual, not so usual way is using, because let's think back to the Unix philosophy. Like there's these different commands that we can put together and then end up with a certain result, right? In Vim's case, it's the same as well. If we want to switch to a certain buffer, with the hard way, we can just go over all the buffers, see if the name checks matches to what we want, and then just stop the process, which is what we can do with the while loop there. And the next one is using ls to see the buffer numbers, which if each buffer comes with a handle, a number, and if I want to switch to a certain one, I just run buffer and then the name. And the other one is using wildcard expansion. This is the way that I prefer. And I actually used to use fzf or various other buffer pickers, but I ended up coming to this one for some reason. It's just the simplicity of it was enough for me. In order to switch those buffers, you just, if we want to go to, say, indirect, I can just tab it and then it completes it. If I'm looking for something specific, I can use these wildcard expansions to get to something else. And then it'll show me the other options. As a tip, I usually map these buffer commands to angle bracket and then B to switch back and forth between buffers. I find it very useful. Now, I showed you that ls command. That ls command presents the list of buffers for us. Once I do the ls, whatever buffer I open, I can see that. But there's another way that we can list buffers in Vim as well, and that is called argument list. And if you look at that help page, help 07.2, that's actually just a funny thing to see there. It just brags that you can edit multiple files with Vim, even though you take it as a granted thing, right? What argument list is, whenever you're launching Vim, and you start with you can either start with a single file, or you can start with multiple files. When you open these multiples, Vim adds these to its argument list. If I show what args is, it shows that I have two files that I opened with the vim command in the argument list, and that angle bracket one is the current file. And in order to switch between these different files, I can use next or previous to go between back and forth. And a good tip with this one, I usually map it to angle bracket A or the other way, angle bracket A, to switch between these different argument lists. And these tool lists actually give you great power when you want to do certain things, which I'll have examples for in the next slides. The other thing, this one Chip already talked about, these special buffers. Special buffers are essentially, they're not really, it's a buffer at the end, but you can add additional functions or change certain options of it to have it do something special for you. Quick fix and the terminal, I think they're prime examples to this, especially the terminal. It becomes very specialized once you get to the terminal. But help and scratch buffers are also special as well in that with scratch buffer, you set buff type to no file, and then you get yourself a scratch buffer that you can do whatever and then just discard. Now that we have an idea of what buffers are, what the types are, we can actually do things with these buffers more than just editing files. And these commands that you see at the top, buffdo, arcdo, and windo, I actually make use of them a lot in my day-to-day work, and they're super useful. And the other, I will leave some references to certain help docs. I highly encourage you to go to these help docs and see what they do, but I won't be going into detail for them. So let's see the first example. Again, all of this is actually, none of it is specific to NeoVim or Vim. It works, anything Vim, it just works. In this case, we want to do a git diff in all the files in a branch, and we want to edit those. Or maybe we want to review a PR, but we don't want to do it on GitHub, and we don't have a plugin to handle that PR process for us. If I change, let's see, I already have 3 files. I'll change my notes here. Okay, and then let's change the other one. Okay, now when I do git status, I can see that there's different files that have been changed, but how do I get them to Vim? So I could just get the diff, it's name only, and then pass it on to, oh, sorry about that. Pass it on to Vim. And when I do this, it adds all these files to my argument list. And the other part of the command is you can actually map the git difflet as you're opening this. You can create run a command with the plus operator there, and that will run that nmap so that you can have a mapping for the git difflet command. But I won't do that for simplicity's sake. Oh, sorry. Let's see what's happening. That is interesting. Oh, I don't know why that's not working. I guess I'll be doing the same in here. Huh. That is also interesting. Oh. Let's see. Okay. Oh. Guys, I don't know why that's not working, but I will not, since I'm on a timer, I will just skip this one so that I don't steal time out of somebody else's talk. So let's get to example 2. With this example, we're again manipulating the argument list to get a list of files from an external command, and then run a command on that list of commands that were received. So let's do rg Linux, and then we get the list of commands from list of files from here, and I can actually these are the buffers. In this case, our buffer number of files in our buffer and argument list is going to be the same. And in order to change something, change Linux to Windows, I'm just going to need to do argdo, which with this method, with this command, it's going to go over each of these arguments and change Linux to Windows. And with this, you can actually, it's not exactly like the multiple find and replace in VS Code, but it comes very close to it if you use the C flag at the end of substitute, so that with each one, you can just ask you whichever one you want to change. The other example is, this is similar to the other one, is searching in multiple files. Let's see how that works. All right, I can use again the fd args command, and with the wildcard expansion, add whatever file that I'm interested in, and then as an extension, maybe I'll use only the C files. Oh, sorry. Okay. So again, I get a list of files from here. And in order to, if I'm interested in only finding things in certain files, I can use argdo grep add and search for whatever the keyword that I'm interested in. And with this command, it's going to go over each of the buffers there. I'm not going to let it do because there's a lot of them. And then it'll add all these files to the quick fix. From here, I can see, if the keyword that I was looking for, and it'll have the files that I'm interested in as well. After that, I can just use the cfdo command to operate on those quick fix items as well. And if there's another option you can use with buffdo. If you don't have the argument list and you're working in Vim, you're interested in a keyword and you don't know which buffer it's in, you can use the same logic with the buffdo command, and it'll show you where those keywords exist, and it'll populate the quick fix buffer. Now, the other thing is, again, these are all operations, and notice that the buffer is our input to these commands. The next example is doing formatting all buffers. If you're working on a C++ project or a Python project, you can just do buffdo and then run the external program to just format all the files for you. And you can even do fancy things with this where you can say, okay, I'm only interested in certain file types and I'll use this executable, and for others I'll use another executable. These are just, you could just write a simple one-line Vim script for this and it'll do what you want. And window, I find is the least useful. I have never come across a use for this, but with window you can actually run a command in all the windows in the same tab page, which assuming if you're doing maybe pair programming, you don't have your numbers turned on and they are struggling telling you which line, you can just run this command, turn all them only in those specific windows and not the others. This is a good example as well that I often use. It's just finding, you can use cexpert. This is a great command that I recommend you get used to. It takes an expression, runs it, and it takes an expression, runs it, and outputs all the input from that external program to the quick fix window, so that you can then see whatever you want to do with that. You can open the files or again run different commands on these to do either replacing or formatting, whichever you prefer. And another good one is this is maybe not that useful for lots of cases, but since you can do anything once you switch to a buffer, you can actually write that to a backup file if you need it. Another one, this is, I find very useful. Sometimes when you're working, there's all sorts of these buffers that pop up. You open something, close something, but when you delete a file, you don't actually delete that from Vim. So you can use this command to just go over the buffers and see which one is not readable and then delete that buffer from your list. And I have, if anyone is interested in learning about more of these commands, I have these exercises, which I'm sure there's going to be a common place. I'll put this up on my GitHub so you can see all these exercises and try out some things yourself. Now, the next one is Unix philosophy. This, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Expect the output of every program to become the input to another. This is actually what we've been doing with the previous commands as well, because the output of our thoughts was the buffer, and then the buffer became an input to our buffer commands, all the buffdo and tabdo commands, or the cfdo. Now, with Vim provides other ways where you can actually turn your buffer into an input device as well. And these are the filter expression, format program, and equal program. And I really wish that Vim had a find program as well, where I can customize the program that's used for the find command, but I don't believe that exists. And if it does, please let me know. Since the things that I've been talking about are all basic things that you can do with just the Vim language, I want to remind everybody that this great talk, how to do 90% of what plugins do. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. I think it should be a must-watch for all Vim users. So you should totally go check that out. Okay, so next up is so we have this Lua code that's not formatted, and we want to format it. As a new Vim user, it's usually common to try to find a plugin for the goal that I want to achieve. Right? You open a file and then you're like, this is not formatted. I want to format it, and you go look for a plugin. But just like that, how to do 90% of plugins do, talk argues. I also argue that you should be familiar with these concepts before you go to that site. So how would I go and format that code without having access to a plugin? But it's actually only using the concepts that we learned so far. I would only need to go highlight the lines that I'm interested in. Format it. So highlight the lines, and this now becomes basically an input. Now it's going to become an input to an external program, and I'm going to run it through Lua format, and it'll take in from the stdin, do its formatting, and spit it out in standard out. So then Vim takes it in and replaces the selected text with the output of that program. This I find, especially if you're working on a markdown file and you have very different these code fences, it's just very useful to not have to have I don't like having a command for every single thing that I'm doing if it's really already easy to do it with just simple Vim commands. And there's also these other iterations that you can try out. You can either use the selection visual marks, or you can just give it a range and then use that. The other interesting part is you can also run the same command and output it to an external program, manipulate it with an external program, and at the end have it output the result of it. So if I run this command, it'll pipe these two lines into low format. Low format will pipe it to sed, and then that will pipe it to another sed, and then the result of that will be in my buffer. Whereas before it was saying loading plugins, and now it got manipulated by external programs and turned into unloading plugins. Well, this is something that I find sometimes useful. I admit it's not always useful. The next thing is these format program and equal program. This has been especially useful for me until I started using EFM lang server for formatting. But with this, you can set your external program with the format PRG option, and that will be run whenever you use GQ command. So we can actually do the same thing in here. If you go to this example, I can change my option, and once I go here and press GQ, it'll actually do the same thing that we did with these commands. It'll pipe the selection into an external program and then just replace the selection with the output of that program. The next one in that family of options is equal PRG, and this one is you could essentially use it for the same purpose, but this one is supposed to do only indenting, whereas the other one is supposed to do formatting. But I think they're really not that different in practice. So you could, if you have different purposes, you can have the format PRG to one external command and then maybe use the other one for another file, so you can do two different things, maybe useful for markdown files that you often edit. And just so as a cool example of this, with GQ, we can turn this again into an input. And if I run this command, I can actually use GQ, change things, and then output that here. Which is, if you have some external scripts that you use in your command line and you want to have access to it in your Vim as well, this is a great way of doing it. All right, now this is, I guess this is the first two commands that we learn, but they're not just useful for opening and reading files. They're actually pretty useful for writing input to an external program as well. So if I take the read command, I can not only read a file, but I can read the output of an external program as well. So let's see an example of it. I want to see, let's see, I'm here, and I want to see what files that I have here. Once I do read and then use the exclamation mark, the commands that we write after that is run in a shell environment, and we get the output here. I use this often when I'm trying to do multiple file renames. It just becomes so useful to get the list of files from a directory and then record a macro for whatever file renaming I need to do, and then just run it all on all the lines, and it makes it super easy to run operations on files. And the other good example is, I'm sure you've seen the REPL plugins out there that takes in a block of code, and then you can easily see the output or pipe it to another terminal. But you can actually do just that with write command as well. So if you type it here, Python will take it in as an input and then interpret it, and then you'll see the output yourself. And if you wanted to replace the contents of this, you could have just done the filter option and write in Python, and your contents would be replaced. Another good, this is also a cool example where you can take the selection, and then instead of showing it, you can just take it to your star register, to your clipboard, and you can just paste it to whatever else you need. And this makes it easy to get it and output it maybe to multiple places instead of getting the output, maybe using the mouse to select stuff. And here's an exercise that you may want to try out. Again, I'm sure this will be on my GitHub profile, GitHub, so you can get it from there. Now, the next stop in Bufferland is the ability to navigate between the buffer and not just across buffers. These, you're probably familiar with marks, and somebody was actually on vimconf asking about the more efficient ways of doing it. Prime has the Harpoon plugin, I believe. That also serves a similar purpose to this. But just as a basic level, you can mark your location within a file with M and then a modifier for it, an ID for it, and then you can have multiple places that you can jump back and forth. I find this useful whenever I'm editing one part of the code and then the definition for something is somewhere else and I need to go quickly back and forth. I usually use just mark my last location, go to the other place, come back to it pretty quickly. It's a bit hard to get used to it first, but once you get used to it, it becomes really natural, and then you can just do things really fast. Another cool thing with the buffer manipulation is the dot command and the macros. You can actually run these in a collection of, in a range of lines, so that if I was adding an extension to this one, I can just select all of them and press dot, and it'll run the same command in all of them. And you can do use that xmap as well. And the other one is the macros, which this is even more powerful than using the dot command in a range. I can do more interesting manipulations, not just adding things to the beginning of the end of the line, and I can run the same macro on multiple files. This is, again, especially useful for multiple batch file renaming. Also, the last thing to mention for jumping in the same buffer is the change list. The change list with G semicolon and G comma. This is especially useful if you're changing, if you change something and then you want to go back to it. You can use these to go back between different change lists. So you don't even have to use marks with that one. This is again, this actually goes great with the do 90% of the things that plugins do talk. And this is an example that I sometimes use in my work. When you're doing the same thing over and over again, sometimes this is basically like a snippet engine. You want to have some boilerplate code, and then whenever you open a file, you want that. You can use the skeleton support for this, which is, it's not really, I think it's a fancy term for just have an auto command that reads a file whenever you're reading a certain file and then reads that into your current buffer. If you're using a plugin, a snippet engine, you're probably already doing this, but just to show that there's actually easier ways of, or no plugin ways of doing these things. And here's an example. This is a cool way of getting a skeleton and then manipulating it to your current project's needs. Maybe you can have some sort of, again, external program that changes the keywords here and there, and then as an output, you have something that's already been manipulated for you. Okay, so there's a last step to tell you why bother with all this when we can actually have plugins to take care of all this, right? I think it's important to know the basic of it, to get a basic understanding of these Vim buffers, Vim commands, especially the buffer ones, because it's at the center of our everyday work. We write and type and manipulate buffers all the time, so it only makes sense that you are able to go between different buffers and understand how they work, understand how we can use it as an input device and pipe it into something else. And the other thing is, you would be able to, instead of relying on, for example, you might have a one-time only need and you want to do it efficiently for a period of time, but you don't have time to look for a plugin for that, right? You can just take advantage of these basic buffer commands and do it yourself instead of just installing a plugin for that purpose. And the other good benefit is, whenever you get stuck, you can just, there has been good talks before about reading the help page. Just look for it yourself, understand the basics, and you get it done. Instead of spending 5 minutes for looking at a plugin, you just take maybe 1 minute and do it yourself, which aids your understanding of your tool, which is, I think, essential, especially for software engineers. And the other part is, this is the most fun I have, is turning your buffer into a playground, because you don't always want to use your terminal. It's useful for a lot of things, but sometimes you want to take the output, do a part of some sort of processing with your keyboard and then pass it on to something else. And for your cases, having an good understanding of buffers is pretty useful. And just to close up, this is just some extra commands that I find really useful. Preview window, and I find that the evaluation register is rarely talked about. I haven't seen that many things about it, but it's pretty useful, especially for short math equations that you need to do. Just as a one-minute introduction, without taking too much time. So after coming to do all of this realization, I wanted to aid in whatever I'm doing with the buffers, but I didn't want too much of too big of a plugin for myself. So I wrote this simple plugin. It's NeoVim only. I wanted to experiment with Lua, learn a bit about it, but it helps you. It basically gives you a better interface to some of the default commands that Vim already provides for you, especially the job starting jobs and getting output from it. It gives you ways of taking the output from the program and inputting it into your buffer and maybe in a quick fix window, but you still have access in an editable location. Because I find that if I'm not able to edit something, the output of a program, then I don't find it that useful. Just to show a few examples, I can have the fd command that runs the external fd program and then gets the output and puts it in again, this is actually one of the special buffers. It's essentially a scratch buffer. Shows the outputs, and from here you can do renaming. You can go into each file, and I find that it gives you more flexibility when you want to do things. And since this is scratch, you don't need to basically pollute your buffer list. Once you're done with it, just close it and be done with it. And as I'll want to show just one more example for this, and then, oh, sorry. All right. Okay, do you have a screen there? Something happened. Okay, so a good example, one of the most...
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
I'm good? Okay, thanks. So the most useful thing that I do with this plugin is just using it as an asynchronous Git function along with Vim Fugitive. And the other good thing that I do as well is just instead of having an entire plugin for my CMake configuration, I usually just depend on this plugin, just a few configuration options, and it just defines the chain of external commands to run with my Vim commands. So this is basically just a few lines of code. You can turn this into something common in your configuration, and you just call one method, one Lua function, and your entire project is ready for all the CMake functionalities. And another useful thing is running asynchronous jobs, and which is useful if you're doing backend. I usually use it for running Django server, which comes in handy so that I don't have to go to a different terminal to do things. I already have a record of whatever the error was. It's easy. I can manipulate. If I run into an exception, for example, I can just go in the history, find a problem, and then fix it, run it again. So I have a history of whatever that output was. And I will quickly show one more example, and then my talk will be over. So that run server example, once I run so in Furvish, you can have a list of these, the jobs that you run are kept in a list, so you can always have access to it. If I go into Furvish jobs, I use the preview window for this purpose. I can look inside, my command was running, and it gives me errors. That's great, because if I want to fix that, and maybe I fix one thing, but another thing popped up, I can take a look into those previous outputs to understand the diff and know what I did wrong or what I didn't do wrong. And I find that pretty powerful. And that's it. There's only some acknowledgements that I want to make here. I absolutely adore Vim Fugitive and Vim Dervish plugins, even though I've been saying like some of the things I don't use plugins for, but I couldn't live without those two, so I really appreciate it. And the other links I highly recommend that you check out for a good bare bones Vim experience.
Awesome.
And that's all. Sorry for all the interruptions,
No,
but I hope it was good.
It was great. Everyone was super pumped. I saw several messages of people super excited, just saying, "We're glad we got everything worked out." They were really pumped and learned a lot of new things. I was just telling Prime during the talk that this is exactly the kind of talk that we love to have at vimconf, showing you how to do, really, really just do Vim, really understand the model of how things are working, understand this sort of base mental model that can really inform everything else that's going on. So we loved it, both of us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.